The stagecoach rattled to a halt in the mud-churned street of Eldridge, Montana, a frontier town huddled against the biting wind of late autumn. Dust swirled like ghosts around the wheels, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant smoke from the surrounding hills. Eleanor Hayes stepped down, her boots sinking into the cold earth, the hem of her faded blue dress brushing against the damp ground. She clutched a worn carpet bag in one hand and a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth in the other, remnants of a life she had pieced together from scraps back east. She had come with a flicker of hope, kindled by a letter from her cousin, Martha, who had promised a place at her hearth. "The West is for starting over," Martha had written, her words curling like smoke on the page. Eleanor had sold her mother's silver locket to afford the journey, trading sentiment for survival. At 32, she was no wide-eyed girl. The world had already carved its judgments into her, widowed to young, childless, whispered about in drawing rooms as barren or cursed. But here, in this raw land, she imagined the whispers might fade. The driver tossed her trunk down with a thud, tipping his hat without a word, before cracking the reins. The coach lumbered away, leaving her alone amid the sparse buildings, a saloon with swinging doors exhaling the sour tang of whiskey, a mercantile with frost-laced windows, and a cluster of clapboard houses leaning into the wind like weary travelers. Snowflakes began to drift, tentative at first, melting on her cheeks like unshed tears. She made her way to Martha's home, a modest cabin on the town's edge, its chimney puffing thin gray smoke. Knocking softly, Eleanor straightened her shawl, feeling the chill seep through the wool. The door creaked open, and there stood Martha, her face pinched and older than Eleanor remembered, lines etched by frontier hardships. "Eleanor?" Martha's voice was sharp, laced with surprise that bordered on dismay. Her eyes flicked over Eleanor's travel-worn appearance, lingering on the faint scar along her jaw, remnant of her late husband's temper, now a silent testament to her endurance. "I've come as you wrote," Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. She offered a small smile, hoping it bridged the years between them. Martha's gaze hardened, shifting to the empty street behind her. "That letter. It was months ago. Things have changed." She hesitated, her hands twisting in her apron. "John, my husband, he's taken ill. The cabin's too small, and with the baby coming, we can't afford another mouth. Folks here talk, Eleanor, about your troubles back home. I can't have that shadow on us." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through Eleanor's chest. She felt the cold deepen, not just from the wind whistling through the pines, but from the rejection blooming in her cousin's eyes. No embrace, no warmth, just the town's unspoken verdict echoing in Martha's voice. Eleanor had crossed half a continent, enduring jolting trains and dusty trails, only to find the promise as fragile as autumn leaves. "I understand," Eleanor murmured, though she didn't, not fully. Her fingers tightened on the carpet bag, the fabric rough against her skin. She wouldn't beg. Dignity was all she had left. Turning away, she walked back into the street, snow now falling in earnest, blanketing the world in white silence. The townsfolk glanced her way, a grizzled miner spitting tobacco, a woman in a bonnet hurrying past with averted eyes, but no one stopped. The West, it seemed, was as unforgiving as the whispers she'd fled. She found shelter that night in the livery stable, bartering an embroidered handkerchief for a spot in the hayloft. The horses shifted below, their breath-warm clouds in the dim light, while outside, the wind howled like a lonely soul. Curled under her shawl, Eleanor stared at the rafters, feeling the weight of isolation press down. Hope had brought her here, but survival would have to sustain her. In the quiet, she traced the threads of her life, frayed, but not broken, and whispered to herself, one stitch at a time. The pain lingered, sharp and intimate, but so did her resolve, a quiet fire against the encroaching winter. The livery stable's hayloft became Eleanor's refuge, its rough beams and musty straw a far cry from the feather bed she'd once known. The wind rattled the slatted walls, sneaking through gaps to chill her skin, but she wrapped her shawl tighter, its frayed edges soft from years of wear. Below, the horses snorted, their warmth rising in faint wisps, a small comfort in the vast loneliness of Eldridge. Her carpet bag sat beside her, its contents two dresses, a worn Bible, and a spool of thread feeling like anchors rather than burdens. Morning broke with a gray sky, snow dusting the ground like ash. Eleanor rose, brushing hay from her skirt, her breath visible in the cold. Martha's rejection stung, a bruise beneath her ribs, but she wouldn't let it define her. She'd survived worse whispers of her bareness, her husband's fists, the pitying glances of neighbors back east. Here, in this unforgiving place, she would carve out something new, even if it was just a corner to call her own. She ventured into town, the muddy street sucking at her boots. The mercantile's bell jangled as she stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of coffee beans and linseed oil. The clerk, a weary man with a pinched face, barely looked up. "No charity here," he muttered, assuming her purpose. Eleanor straightened, her voice calm but firm. "I'm looking for work. I sew, mend, whatever's needed," he scoffed, pointing to a sign. "No help wanted." She nodded, undeterred, and moved on. To the boarding house. The matron, Mrs. Calloway, eyed her scar and plain dress with suspicion. "Got no rooms for drifters," she said, her lips tight. "Try the saloon." Eleanor's stomach twisted, but she thanked her politely, stepping back into the cold. The saloon was no place for her, not yet, not ever if she could help it. Instead, she knocked on doors, offering to darn socks or patch quilts. Most were slammed shut. One woman took her card of needles as payment for a stale biscuit. By dusk, Eleanor returned to the hayloft, her hands raw from the cold, her heart heavier but unbroken. She lit a stub of candle, its flame wavering like her hope, and began mending a tear in her shawl. Each stitch was deliberate, a quiet act of defiance against the world's coldness. The needle moved through the fabric, steady as a heartbeat, and in its rhythm, she found solace. She was alone, yes, but not defeated. The frontier was harsh, but so was she, forged in pain, tempered by perseverance. As snow fell outside, she whispered to the flickering light, "I am enough." The words felt fragile, but they were hers, and they would hold her through the night. Days blurred into weeks as Eleanor pieced together a fragile existence in Eldridge. The hayloft remained her home, its straw prickling through her thin blanket, but she rose each dawn with purpose, shaking off the night's chill like dew from a leaf. Winter deepened, snow piling against the stable walls, muffling the world outside. She bartered with the stable owner, mending his torn coat for continued shelter, her needle flashing in the dim lantern light. Each stitch was a thread of continuity, binding her to this new life. She began with small tasks, knocking on doors under the gray sky, her breath fogging the air. At the blacksmith's, she darned his wife's curtains, fingers numb from the cold as she sat by their hearth. The woman, broad-shouldered and stern, paid her in flour and a heel of bread, but not without a sidelong glance at Eleanor's scar. "Heard you came running from trouble," she muttered, her words sharp as a forge hammer. Eleanor met her eyes steadily. "We all run from something," she replied softly, folding the mended fabric. No more was said, but the judgment lingered, a shadow in the room. Words spread slowly, like frost creeping over glass. She baked simple loaves in a borrowed oven at the boarding house, the scent of rising dough a rare warmth in the biting air. Mrs. Calloway grudgingly allowed it, taking a cut. For the fuel, her lips pursed in disapproval. "A woman alone, folks wonder why," she said one evening, as Eleanor kneaded the dough, flour dusting her arms like snow. Eleanor paused, feeling the weight of unspoken accusations, ruined, unmarriageable, a burden. But she pressed on, her hands firm on the resilient mass. "Wondering doesn't change the bread," she answered quietly, shaping it with care. In the mercantile, she mended shirts for miners, their rough wool scratching her palms. The men leered sometimes, whispering about her Eastern ways and widow's solitude, but she kept her head down, her stitches even and strong. One afternoon, a young mother hired her to sew a quilt for her child, patches of calico and flannel pieced together like fragments of hope. As Eleanor worked in the woman's cramped cabin, the fire crackling softly, she heard the gossip from the next room. "She's got that mark, husband must have had reason." The words pierced, but Eleanor focused on the needle's rhythm, each pull of thread a quiet affirmation. She was more than their stories. She was the mender, the baker, the survivor. By evening, back in the loft, she counted her earnings, coins clinking in her palm, enough for a bit of thread and cheese. The wind howled outside, snow sifting through cracks, but she wrapped herself in the shawl she'd repaired, its warmth a symbol of her tenacity. No one saw her tears in the dark, but they dried quickly. Crumbling wasn't an option. In this harsh land, she was building not just a living, but a self, stitch by stitch, loaf by loaf. The judgments were like winter's grip, cold and unrelenting. But spring would come, and so would her thaw. Winter's grip tightened on Eldridge, the snow drifting in lazy veils across the frozen ground, turning the world into a muted palette of white and gray. Eleanor had claimed a corner of the mercantile as her makeshift workspace, allowed by the reluctant clerk in exchange for mending his inventory of torn sacks and faded aprons. She sat by the pot-bellied stove, its heat a faint barrier against the chill seeping through the floorboards, her needle dipping rhythmically into fabric. The air smelled of kerosene and dried apples, a comforting undercurrent amid the town's persistent judgments. Folks came and went, their boots tracking in slush that pooled like accusations at her feet. Whispers followed her still about the scar, her solitary ways, the mystery of her arrival, but she met them with quiet poise, her hands never faltering. She baked pies now too, using the boarding house oven on off days, selling slices to miners for a few cents. The crusts were flaky, scented with cinnamon. She'd bartered for, each one a small testament to her unyielding spirit. It was on a bitter afternoon, the wind howling like a distant train, that Elias Thorne first truly noticed her. He was a widower, of 40, his ranch a few miles out, where he tended cattle with the same steadfast patience he applied to everything. His wife had passed 3 years prior, taken by fever, leaving him with a quiet house and a daughter, young Clara, who helped as best she could. Elias came to town weekly for supplies, his broad frame filling the doorway, his hat dusted with snow. He wasn't one for talk. His grief had carved him into a man of few words, his blue eyes holding depths like the frozen river beyond the hills. That day, he paused at the counter, unloading sacks of flour, when his gaze fell on Eleanor. She was piecing a quilt from scraps, calico flowers blooming under her fingers, a garden and cloth where none grew outside. Not pity stirred in him, nor the crude interest she'd seen in others' eyes. Instead, it was curiosity, the way her hands moved with such deliberate grace, turning cast-offs into something whole. He watched for a moment, silent, then approached slowly, his boots scraping softly on the wood. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and even, like gravel underfoot. He tipped his hat, revealing hair streaked with gray at the temples. "That quilt, it's fine work. My girl's got a blanket needs mending. Holes from the moths." Eleanor looked up, her hazel eyes meeting his without flinching. She saw no judgment there, only a straightforward need. "I can mend it," she replied quietly, setting aside her needle. "Bring it next time you're in." He nodded, a faint warmth in his expression, not a smile, but a softening around the eyes. "Appreciate it." He placed a coin on the table, more than fair, and turned to leave, but paused at the door. Glancing back, he added, "Name's Elias Thorne, ranch out by Willow Creek." "Eleanor Hayes," she said, her voice steady, though her heart quickened slightly at the simple exchange. No questions about her past, no probing stares. As he stepped into the snow, the bell jingling behind him, Eleanor resumed her stitching. The encounter lingered, a subtle shift in the cold air, like the first crack in ice before spring. He hadn't seen her as broken or burdensome. He'd seen her skill, her presence. In a town of closed doors, it was a quiet opening, and though she didn't dwell on it, the thread in her hand felt a little less solitary. The weeks following Elias's first visit unfolded like the slow melt of snow under a hesitant sun, each encounter weaving an invisible thread between them. Winter held Eldridge in its icy embrace, the days short and shadowed, but Eleanor's routine gained a subtle rhythm. She continued her mending at the mercantile, her fingers deft with needle and thread, turning ragged edges into seamless holes. The townsfolk's whispers had dulled to a background hum, like the wind through the pines, persistent but no longer piercing. She baked tarts now too, using dried apples from the store's barrels, their tangy sweetness a quiet rebellion against the season's barrenness. Elias returned the next week, as promised, carrying a bundled blanket under his arm. It was soft wool, faded blue with moth-eaten holes, a relic from his late wife's hands. He placed it on the table beside her without fanfare, his presence solid and unassuming. "Whenever you can," he said, his voice carrying the low timbre of someone accustomed to speaking to the land more than people. Eleanor nodded, unfolding the fabric gently, her touch reverent. She noticed the careful patches already there, evidence of love worn thin by time. As she worked over the days, she chose threads that matched, blending new with old, each stitch a silent acknowledgement of loss and continuity. When he came back, she handed it to him, folded neatly, the repairs invisible to all but the closest eye. He inspected it quietly, his callous fingers tracing the mended spots. "You've given it life again," he murmured, meeting her gaze. No questions about her scar or her solitude, only appreciation for the work before him. He paid her fairly, adding a small sack of flour from his ranch. "For your baking," he added, a gesture that warmed her more than the stove's heat. Their meetings became a pattern, subtle, unhurried. He'd stop by for supplies, lingering a moment to watch her sew or to purchase a tart, its crust golden and fragrant. Once, as snow flurried outside, he shared a silence with her by the window, both staring at the white expanse. "Clara loves the blanket," he said eventually, breaking the quiet. "Says it's warmer now." Eleanor smiled faintly, feeling the words settle like a shawl around her shoulders. In return, she began leaving small things: a mended glove he'd forgotten, a tart wrapped in cloth, gestures born of observation rather than obligation. He never pried into her past, and she offered no explanations. Their connection grew in the spaces between words, rooted in mutual respect. One evening, as he left with a nod, their hands brushed accidentally, a spark of warmth in the cold air. Eleanor felt it linger, a quiet awakening, like the first green shoot pushing through frozen soil. Her resilience deepened, not from grand triumphs, but from these shared silences, where she was seen not as wounded, but as whole. As winter's hold began to loosen, the snow melting into rivulets that carved muddy paths through Eldridge, Eleanor felt a subtle shift within herself, like the earth awakening beneath the frost. Her days remained a tapestry of quiet labor, mending by the mercantile stove, baking in the dim light of dawn, each act reinforcing her resilience. The townsfolk's judgments had faded to occasional glances, no longer barbs but mere echoes. She had built a small world here, thread by thread, and in it, Elias's presence had become a steady weave. Their encounters grew warmer, though still wrapped in silence. He'd bring Clara sometimes, the girl of 12 with her father's blue eyes and a shy curiosity. Eleanor would offer her a tart, watching as Clara's face lit with rare delight, the fruit's tang cutting through the child's reserved demeanor. Elias would nod his thanks, his hand brushing Eleanor's as he accepted a wrapped bundle for the road home. These touches were accidental at first, then lingered a heartbeat longer, a silent language blooming between them. One crisp morning, with the first hints of spring in the air, the scent of damp soil and budding willows, Eleanor decided on a gesture. It wasn't grand. She wasn't one for declarations. But in her hayloft refuge, by candlelight, she had baked a special tart, apples layered with cinnamon and a touch of honey she'd traded for, the crust woven in a lattice like the quilts she mended. It was more than food. It was a piece of her heart, shaped by hands that had known loss and rebuilding. She wrapped it in clean muslin, tying it with a bit of ribbon from her sewing kit, and carried it to the mercantile, her steps light despite the mud clinging to her boots. Elias arrived. Midday, his wagon creaking under sacks of grain. He tipped his hat as always, his eyes softening when they met hers. "Morning, Eleanor," he said, the name rolling off his tongue with a familiarity that warmed her. She handed him the bundle without preamble, her voice steady but soft. "For you and Clara, fresh this morning." Her fingers trembled slightly as she released it, an emotional risk, exposing a vulnerability she'd guarded like a flame in the wind. Would he see it as pity, or worse, presumption? But she held his gaze, her resilience shining through the quiet offering. He unwrapped a corner, the aroma rising like a memory of home. His expression shifted, not surprise, but a deep, silent gratitude that etched lines around his eyes. He didn't speak at once, instead tracing the lattice with a finger, as if reading the care woven there. It's kindly done," he murmured finally, his voice rough with unspoken emotion. He met her eyes, the warmth in them like sunlight piercing clouds. No questions, no probing, just acceptance, pure and profound. As he tucked the tart away, their hands touched deliberately this time, his callous palm lingering against her smoother one. The moment stretched, a bridge of mutual respect and budding affection. Eleanor felt the risk rewarded, her heart thawing further in the spring air. He nodded once more before leaving, but the gesture lingered, a symbol of shared kindness in a world that had offered her little. In that silence, their bond deepened, stitch by invisible stitch. Spring unfurled in Eldridge, the hills greening under a sky no longer heavy with snow. The town buzzed with preparations for the annual May Fair, a rare burst of color and chatter. Amid the frontier's austerity, stalls lined the muddy street, draped with bunting that fluttered like new leaves, offering jams, quilts, and whittled toys. The air carried the scent of fresh-baked cornbread and the tang of cider, mingling with the earthiness of thawed soil. Eleanor, now a familiar figure, moved through the crowd with quiet purpose, her basket heavy with apple tarts she'd baked at dawn, their golden crusts a testament to her steady hands. She wore her best dress, a simple gray cotton she'd mended with care, its hem embroidered with tiny blue flowers, a private defiance against the town's lingering whispers. Her scar, less noticeable in the sunlight, still drew glances, but she held her head high, her hazel eyes clear. She had carved a place here, not with loud demands, but with the quiet dignity of her work. The tarts sold steadily, coins clinking into her palm, each transaction a small victory over the rejection she'd faced months ago. Elias arrived with Clara, the girl clutching a quilt Eleanor had helped her mend, its bright patches glowing like a patchwork meadow. He nodded to Eleanor from across the crowd, his broad shoulders cutting a steady path through the bustle. When he reached her stall, Clara darted forward, offering a shy smile. "Pa says your tarts are better than Mama's were," she whispered, then flushed, glancing at Elias. He chuckled softly, a rare sound, and met Eleanor's gaze. "She's not wrong," he said, his voice warm but measured, carrying no pity, only truth. He bought 2 tarts, handing one to Clara, who bit into it with glee. The crowd noticed their eyes flicking from Eleanor to Elias, whispers stirring like leaves in a breeze. "The widower and the widow," a woman muttered nearby, her tone sharp with speculation. "What's a man like him doing with her kind?" Eleanor felt the words, a familiar sting, but she didn't falter. Elias, sensing the shift, stepped closer, his presence a quiet shield. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His steady gaze and the way he lingered at her stall said enough. When Clara tugged his sleeve, pointing to a fiddler starting up, he invited Eleanor, with a tilt of his head. "Care to walk with us?" She hesitated, the weight of eyes heavy, then set her basket down. They moved through the fair together, Clara chattering between them, the trio an unspoken unit. The whispers followed, but so did curious glances, some softer now, as if seeing her anew through Elias's respect. By the fiddler's stall, Clara danced, and Elias offered Eleanor a hand, his touch firm yet gentle. They swayed briefly, a moment of shared rhythm, her heart lifting like the music. The town saw her not as ruined, but as chosen, and in that public light, Eleanor stood taller, her transformation blooming in the spring air, rooted in their quiet bond. The Mayfair had softened Eldridge's edges, but as summer crept in, the night still carried a chill, the stars sharp against a velvet sky. Eleanor had moved from the hayloft to a small rented room above the mercantile, its slanted ceiling and single window a step toward permanence. Her days were filled with sewing and baking, her hands weaving stability from thread and dough, but her thoughts often drifted to Elias, his quiet presence, the way his eyes held hers without demand. Their bond had grown like a river carving, a path, steady and unspoken, built on shared silences and small kindnesses. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, painting the horizon in hues of amber and rose, Elias knocked on her door. He held a lantern, its glow casting shadows across his weathered face, his hat tucked under one arm. "Thought you might walk with me," he said, voice low, almost hesitant. "Clara's with the neighbor. Full moon tonight." Eleanor paused, her needle still in the quilt she was mending, a patchwork of scraps, each piece a story of survival. She set it aside, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, the wool soft against her skin, and followed him into the night. They walked beyond the town, along a path to Willow Creek, where the water murmured over stones, reflecting the moon's silver light. The air smelled of sagebrush and damp earth, a quiet promise of summer's warmth. They stopped by the creek. The lantern set on a flat rock, its light unnecessary under the moon's glow. Elias stood close, his hands in his pockets, gazing at the water. Silence stretched, comfortable but heavy with unspoken weight. Eleanor felt her heart quicken, sensing this moment was different, like the air before a storm. "You've made a place here," he said finally, his voice rough but deliberate, like he'd rehearsed the words. "Not just in town, with me, with Clara." He turned to her, his blue eyes catching the moonlight, raw with something deeper than gratitude. "I see you, Eleanor. Not what folks say, not that scar, not your past. I see a woman who builds something, strong out of nothing, who makes things whole again." Her breath caught, his words unpeeling layers she'd guarded for years. She wanted to look away, to hide the tremor in her chest, but his gaze held her, steady and unguarded. "I didn't come here to be seen," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the creak. "But you make me feel I could be." He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking to a breath. "You already are," he said, his hand reaching for hers, calluses brushing her skin with a tenderness that felt like a vow. No kiss followed, not yet, just their hands entwined, the creek's song weaving around them. In that quiet unveiling, under the vast Montana sky, Eleanor's heart opened, not to grand promises, but to the truth of being known. Their bond, forged in respect, bloomed into love, as natural and inevitable as the moon's rise. Summer spread its warmth over Eldridge, the hills blooming with wildflowers, purple lupine and golden sunflowers swaying in the breeze. Eleanor's life had taken root in the town, her small room above the mercantile now adorned with a quilt of her own making, its vibrant patches a map of her resilience. Her days were busy with sewing and baking, her tarts a staple at the mercantile, their buttery aroma drawing smiles even from those who once whispered. But it was the quiet moments with Elias that felt like home, his steady presence, the way Clara's laughter filled the spaces between their silences. One sunlit afternoon, Elias drove his wagon into town, Clara perched beside him, her braid swinging as she waved at Eleanor. He'd come to invite her to the ranch, a sprawling spread by Willow Creek where cottonwoods rustled and cattle lowed in the distance. "Thought you might help us with the garden," he said, his voice carrying a shy hope. "Clara's got big ideas for flowers, but we're no good with plants." Eleanor smiled, tucking a stray hair behind her ear, feeling the warmth of his invitation settle in her chest. She packed a basket with tools and a fresh tart, then climbed onto the wagon, her skirt brushing the worn wood. The ride was quiet, save for Clara's chatter about marigolds and Elias's occasional hum of agreement, his hands steady on the reins. The ranch came into view, a sturdy cabin with a sagging fence, fields stretching toward the horizon, alive with the scent of warm grass and leather. They spent the day planting, Eleanor kneeling in the soft earth, her hands guiding Clara's to press seeds into the soil. Elias worked nearby, mending the fence, his hammer's rhythm a counterpoint to the breeze. By dusk, the garden was marked with neat rows promise in the dirt. They sat on the porch, sharing the tart, its sweetness mingling with the evening's cool air. Clara dozed against Eleanor's shoulder, and Elias's gaze lingered, soft and certain. "Stay," he said quietly, the word carrying more than an evening's invitation. "This place, it's better with you here. Clara needs you. I need you." His hand found hers, rough but warm, a proposal woven in touch and truth. "Marry me, Eleanor. Build this with us." Her heart swelled, not with grand romance, but with the quiet certainty of belonging. "Yes," she whispered, her voice steady, like a stitch sealing a seam. They sat in silence, hands clasped, the future taking shape, garden, fence, home rooted in mutual respect and a love grown slow and true. The summer sun hung low over Eldridge, casting a golden glow across the ranch where Eleanor and Elias stood together, their hands joined in a quiet ceremony. The preacher's words were simple, carried by the warm breeze that rustled the cottonwoods along Willow Creek. Clara stood nearby, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked with Eleanor, lupine and sunflowers woven with care, their vibrant colors a mirror of the life they were building. The guests were few, the mercantile clerk, Mrs. Calloway, softened by time, and a handful of ranchers who'd come to respect Eleanor's quiet strength. No grand affair, just the honest weight of vows spoken under an open sky. Eleanor wore her gray dress, its embroidered flowers catching the light, a symbol of her journey from rejection to renewal. Her scar, once a mark of shame, now felt like a quiet badge of survival, unnoticed by Elias's steady gaze. He stood tall in a clean shirt, his hat set aside, his blue eyes holding hers with a depth that needed no words. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Elias squeezed her hand, a silent promise deeper than any spoken. Their kiss was brief, tender, a seal on the intimacy they'd cultivated. Through shared silences and small gestures, after the gathering moved to the porch, where Eleanor's tarts, apple and cinnamon, baked that morning, sat beside a jug of cider. Clara laughed, her face smudged with crumbs, and the fiddler from the fair played a soft tune, the notes drifting like fireflies. Eleanor and Elias shared a dance, their steps unpracticed but sure, her hand resting in his, the warmth of his touch Grounding her, the townsfolk watched, some with lingering curiosity, but their whispers had lost their sting. Eleanor was no longer the wounded widow. She was a woman whole, chosen, and rooted. As night fell, the stars emerged, bright against the Montana sky. The guests departed, and Clara ran off to chase fireflies, leaving Eleanor and Elias alone on the porch. They sat in silence, her shawl draped over them both, the scent of sagebrush mingling with the faint sweetness of leftover tarts. He turned to her, his voice low, steady. "You reminded me who I already was," he said, echoing a truth she'd carried in her heart since the night by the creek. Eleanor leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, feeling the rhythm of his breath. "And you me," she whispered. In that shared silence, their love, a quiet, resilient bloom, held them fast, a testament to dignity, healing, and a life rebuilt together.